Let's go ahead and take on Tribble's Chapter 1 of God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality and see what's being said here that we can glean for the idea of feminism some 30, 40 years on, and some of the ideas that Tribble had put forth so really clearly for us. So Tribble organized this particular chapter into 3 sections where she talks about the hermeneutical clue within the text and between the text and the world, the methodological clue being rhetorical criticism, and the topical clue where she discusses Genesis 1:27. So if we go and look into the clues in the text in the first section here, what she's taking on when she talks about the text and the world are issues that were prevalent at that point in time. This wave of feminism was concerned with these things, and I think it's interesting to kind of review and see what has actually changed and what we're still concerned with now. According to Tribble, feminism is my concluding illustration of involvement between the world and the Bible. By feminism, I do not mean a narrow focus upon women, but rather a critique of culture in light of misogyny. This critique affects the issues of race, class, psychology, ecology, and human sexuality. For some people today, the Bible supports female slavery and male dominance in culture, while for others it offers freedom from sexism. Okay, so here Tribble does use the term misogyny, but she doesn't use it very often. And again, by now, this many years on, that word also is beginning to kind of take on a buzzword type of characteristic, but she uses it quite clearly here to talk about a male domination within the text of the Bible and how our society today, or that day, still was reflecting, probably even more than now, a real sense of being male dominated. I like to think that in the years between then and now that we've made lots of progress. And having conversations with people my daughter's age, it's really interesting to see they're not happy with the amount of progress that's being made. And I had a conversation with one who said, no, it's not enough until everything is fixed. And then I thought to her and said to her, I think probably it's time for you all to kind of take this on then, because I think I'm happy because I've seen progress, and she still wants more progress. So there's a continuum of progress being made and progress that needs to be made. And yet these are still some basic categories, which there are improvements, but we need on the outside world especially, but also within the inner workings of the churches to be aware of the fact that we could strengthen one another in these areas and to kind of move on from there. Okay, so again, Tribble is extremely articulate with what she wants to do and how she wants to do it. So looking at page 8, the methodological clue, she talks about the process of understanding, and she then very clearly articulates her chosen sort of way of going about things. My choice is rhetorical criticism, a discipline I place under the general rubric of literary criticism. According to this discipline, the major clue to interpretation is the text itself. Thus, I view the text as a literary creation with an interlocking structure of words and motifs. Proper analysis of form yields proper articulation of meaning. And farther down the page, last paragraph, a literary approach to hermeneutics concentrates primarily on the text rather than on extrinsic factors such as historical background, archaeological data, compositional history, authorial intention, sociological setting, or theological motivation and approach. So in a sense, my own text world theory jumps off from Tribble, being a literary approach, and yet I like to think that text world theory allows us to knit back in some of these other features as we're reading the text, that we can read the text with an eye to some of the other things that may have affected how that text was written. So text world theory is basically a linguistic literary approach, where rhetorical criticism is a literary approach that encounters certain interrelationships between form and meaning. And so this is a close place from where I jumped off doing my own PhD work to continue on to see what else we could find out about reading text and kind of keeping that focus on the text. Okay, so the final and important thing here is the topical clue. So if we look at the topical clue, let's see where she puts this. Page 12 is where it begins, and then she goes on and on with a really good analysis of this topical clue from a number of different angles. The topical clue is Genesis 1:27. And here she says, it gives the first scriptural clue for the subject of God and the rhetoric of sexuality. And this is where I like to jump off with the idea as well when we're reading women's stories in the Old Testament to point out that the idea of gender, God created creation of humankind in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female, created he them. That the way Tribble unpacks this is really a great compliment to the genders, the idea that God created this and called it good. Okay, now I'm specifically skirting issues which are on the table today, which probably were not so obvious during Tribble's time of writing, and that would be the idea of multiple gender identities and that kind of thing. I want to concentrate on the biblical text here for a little while to see that when God created humankind, he called it good. Okay, and so there's a real positive way of looking at humanity that sometimes I think we tend to lose in our idea of creating theology, which talks about the fall and so forth and so on. But I think it's really important that this is the first thing we find out in the whole Bible. Again, the privilege of primacy. The first thing we find out in the whole Bible is that God was pleased with his creation. And I think God is pleased with his creation today. And I think God is especially pleased with his creation when we find that restoration through Christ. But that looking through the Old Testament, we can see things that would be extremely distressing, but we also see things, and our first thing that we see is that God thought humanity was pretty good. Okay? So the idea here that she's going through there is to explain Genesis 1:27, and I hope we can keep that sense of positivity going on, that all is not lost. All is not lost, that there is a real basis upon which we can look at humanity as being God's good creation and something God was pleased with. And I like the way she reads this on page 16. I think it really reinforces how repetition as a literary effect can affect how we read and understand. So looking here, and created God humankind in his image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And she talks about the sophistication of the structure and the corresponding meaning. And I don't think this ever really gets old for me, because I think a lot of times we do need to be reassured that even though we've got the sinful problem, that God found us to be good and he wanted restoration for all of us in here. So there's good news here, even with Old Testament text. Okay, now continuing on page 22, she talks about metaphor. And I think this is a really useful paragraph, the second paragraph down. As a clue for interpreting scripture, the metaphor can function in two ways. First, it can direct attention to partial metaphors of male and female by placing them within an encompassing network. For instance, metaphors such as God the Father, the husband, the king, the warrior, are diverse and partial expressions of the image of God male. By the same token, metaphors such as God the pregnant woman, the mother, the midwife, and the mistress are diverse and partial expressions of the image of God female. All of these partial metaphors involve societal roles and relationships which the basic metaphor organizes without necessarily promoting. So there's not a hierarchy being set up, it's the fact that these are the way things are. In fact, the basic metaphor contrasts with the imbalance in these partial metaphors. It presents an equality in the image of God, male and female, although the Bible overwhelmingly fails male metaphors for deity. Okay. A second way in which our metaphor can function is to direct attention to traditions in the Old Testament that embody male and female within comparable context. This context is the goodness of creation that dispels chaos, the goodness that ultimately is fulfilling and life-enhancing. So from the chapter 1 of Genesis, Tribble has taken and established a baseline for looking at gender roles in the Bible by looking at male and female created in the image of God. Okay, and then she very clearly wraps up this chapter. Within Scripture, my topical clue is a text. the image of God, male and female. To interpret this topic, my methodological clue is rhetorical criticism. Outside Scripture, my hermeneutical clue is an issue: feminism as a critique of culture. These clues meet now as the Bible again wanders through the history to merge past and present. And then she goes on to introduce the remainder of her volume. Okay, so we can see that for Tribble, clarity comes from looking at the text in various ways. Her big contribution here is including the idea of feminism a little bit bigger than just looking at women's issues, but looking at the issues of inequality, where we would want to be finding some parity for things. What wasn't there is the current climate that we're struggling with at this point in time, and how to resolve the idea of male and female in Scripture with what's being stated in a lot of ways, trying to create gender fluidity and those kinds of things. Now, I don't have a big answer for that based upon the text, because really the text doesn't go there. The only thing we find in the text that's a little unusual are the eunuchs once in a while, who are started out male but are not anymore. Something that doesn't really happen too often in culture these days. But there are big issues out there, and I'm wondering for us and for your generation in particular, who are starting out on academic careers, if there's a way to articulate the connection between Bible and society these days in as clear and I think an effective manner as what Tribble did when she wrote. And I believe this actually was written in the 70s. So we've got a little water under the bridge, but also a very fine example of taking on issues, creating something that's very readable, very not exactly neutral, but not exactly real flamboyant either. Okay, there are some feminist writings that are extremely flamboyant and kind of create distress where there doesn't need to be any. And I think for Tribble, she's managed to be very even-handed and created a very formal piece that actually engages both biblical text, culture, and good academics all together. So I want to encourage you, as you're thinking of writing your papers for the final paper for this class, to think, how does this style work? Can I make it work for me? We have another paper we'll be writing in the next 2 weeks. It was due supposedly this week, but I think we need a little more time. And that's the one that takes on the idea of kind of gender in Old Testament story and how we're going to integrate that with faithful, not only faithful reading, but faithful interpretation for those around us. And that might be a little more challenging than I think what is the time frame for this week. So I want to give you another week on that. And I'll give you some more instructions on writing that paper. But for now, I will talk to you again very soon about Hagar, and we will be in touch again.